First of all, can I just say it's an absolute pleasure to be here. The opportunity to speak in front of a crowd, such as it is, for the first time in 18 months, rather than sitting upstairs in my office, top floor, in the sweltering heat, in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt in front of the computer screen on a Teams meeting is extraordinary. Can I also say it's been a pleasure to be a part of the Commission, to work with the Commissioners, the academics and the staff of APSE on this report. And I've absolutely learnt a huge deal, particularly from the Commissioners, and not least, of course, the benefits and dark arts of the ad lib from Gary. However, what I would say is, while I absolutely admire those skills, it ultimately isn't my style, and in any way I spent at least a day writing up these notes, and so you'll excuse me if I actually go back to the script. What we heard through the Commission loud and clear on finance, which is this particular chapter of the report, is that the current system of local government funding just isn't sustainable. Overall funding for local authorities has fallen significantly over the last decade, falling in real terms between 2009 and 2018 by some 19%. And as a share of GDP, we're now at a level which is the lowest level we've slumped to since 1948. Furthermore, the impact of cuts has been uneven, with the poorest hit hardest. For example, the level of cuts has varied massively between authorities, ranging from 46% of net spend in one authority to just 1.6% of spend in another. Children's services spending has fallen by 14% in the most deprived local authorities in the 8 years to 2018-19, but increased by 9% in the least deprived. And the New Policy Institute found that 97% of the reduction in council spending on services for disadvantaged adults and children took place in the most deprived fifth of local areas. Within councils, funding cuts have fallen disproportionately on discretionary services, such as planning, environment and parks, and culture, with these services seeing average reductions of some 40% per adult, as councils have prioritised spending on statutory services. The rising demand for statutory services, and in particular social care, has become a major pressure on council budgets. 57% of all local authority spend on average is now accounted for by social care services, with some individual authorities spending between 70% and 18% of their net budget in these areas. And yet demand for adult and care services continues to rise, outstripping the additional one-off funding and extra council tax increases agreed by government to address the issue. There continues to be a tension between the drive for localisation and the need for redistribution between authorities. And as an increasing proportion of government funding is allocated per capita rather than based on need, councils in less affluent areas are losing out, leading to variation in the scale of funding cuts, differential levels of council tax, and the quality of services. Furthermore, if implemented, the government's fair funding review proposals are likely to amplify this trend, with councils in poorer areas projected to lose some £320 million a year, while county councils in the South East, by contrast, gain upwards of £300 million a year. Serial rounds of competitive bidding continue to be a problem. So while significant capital and development funding has been subject to competition, the amount of funding allocated in this way is now increasing. Consequently, this funding is effectively controlled by central government, is open to patronage and partisanship, and requires councils to spend significant resources on bids with no guarantee of success. Finally, these enduring failures in the current funding system have been accelerated and intensified during the pandemic. In March 2021, the National Audit Office reported that councils estimated £9.7 billion worth of COVID cost pressures and lost income. And despite extra support from central government, the Local Government Association has suggested that there remains a £2.6 billion gap in the resources that councils need if those extra costs are to be met in full. To date, 3/4 of authorities continue to report that funding gap due to the pandemic, with shire districts often reliant on sales fees and charges particularly badly hit, with commercial income down by almost 1/4 on pre-COVID-19 levels. So those are the kind of things that we've heard, and the Commission's response is clear through its recommendations. Our first recommendation is that to be effective, councils need stable finance built on a long-term and predictable financial settlement so they can plan for the future. Consequently, we believe as a Commission that the settlement should be negotiated, agreed and allocated to each authority every 5 years, be sufficient to ensure councils can fulfil their legal responsibilities and meet the needs of local communities, be available to use as councils see fit, subject only to legislation and the local democratic process, and should increase to fully fund any additional responsibilities allocated by central government to local government. Our second recommendation is that total local government funding should not fall below an agreed percentage of gross domestic product. Since 2010, central government has found it politically easy to cut funding to councils due to the legislative requirement on councils to balance budgets. Setting a floor for total local government spend wouldn't mean an end to reduction in government support, but would ensure any reductions or increases are proportionate to those experienced elsewhere in the public sector. Our third recommendation is that once total local government spend has been agreed with government, it should be local government itself that decides how funding is allocated between authorities. Of course, this won't be easy, and inevitably there'll be differences in the needs and expectations of individual councils and tiers of administration. However, it is our view that better that councils negotiate and agree than central government unilaterally decides alone. Our fourth recommendation is that a significant part of council funding should continue to be raised locally. If local government is to be more than just local administration, local politicians have to be accountable to the electorate for the way they spend taxes collected locally. However, the link between local taxation and local spend is currently unclear, and consequently we believe both council tax and business rates should be subject to revaluation and reform. Our fifth recommendation is that as well as a share of national funding, councils should be able to raise council tax and business rates and to introduce new specific local and hypothecated taxes as they see fit. Councils should be able to tax and spend to suit the needs and preferences of their community, while subsequently being held accountable for those decisions at the ballot box. Our sixth recommendation is that the need for financial stability is urgent, and in advance of any new way to decide, allocate and fund local government, central government should agree a transitional multi-year settlement to help repair the damage done by a decade of funding cuts and by the pandemic. For many authorities, funding services and meeting growing community need while accommodating major cuts in government grant have left them focusing on short-term finance rather than the long-term interests of their community. Add to that the unforeseen pressures of the pandemic, the loss of commercial income, and the increased costs of keeping the public safe, and it's no surprise that many councils across the country are in financial crisis. The system needs repair, and while the case for long-term reform is clear, the need to sort out short-term problems and to address current concerns is equally pressing. Our seventh recommendation and final recommendation in this chapter is that centrally funded national programmes should no longer be distributed through competitive funding, but on clear principles agreed by central and local government. All too often, government funding comes with strings attached and is allocated in a partisan and patrician way. For too long, councils have been required to compete for essential funding, committing scarce officer time and financial resources to a beauty parade, the outcome of which is uncertain and often objectively unfair. Furthermore, inadequate funding, wasteful and inefficient processes and misguided advice remain unchallenged by councils fearful of losing out if they dare to speak up. This needs to change, and the Commission took the view that centrally funded national programmes should no longer be distributed through secretive competitive process, but instead funding allocated transparently on clear principles agreed in advance by central and local government. So to conclude, I would say this. For too long, local government funding has been built on the shifting sands of an ever-changing system of taxation, funding formulae and regulation that has seen short-term finance prioritised over long-term planning and investment. Instead, stability, fairness, flexibility and accountability should underpin the way we fund local services, and the Commission's recommendations set out how we can achieve that. So that's it on finance.